Chapel Podcast.
During this week, we've been enjoying the ministry of Dr. Harold Netland as he's been lecturing on the subject of globalization and missions. Every one of us understands that we are living in a globalized world where almost anything that we do is affecting people far, far away, and what they're doing is affecting us. And this is entering into the influence on our ministries here in North America and around the world. Dr. Harold Netland is Professor of Philosophy of Religion and Intercultural Studies and the Naomi Faust Chair of Missions at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He began teaching at Trinity, which, by the way, is my alma mater, in 1993. Prior to coming to Trinity, Dr. Netland was a missionary in Japan for 9 years, and for part of that time he was teaching at Tokyo Christian University, and he's also taught at Biola College and Talbot Theological Seminary. And his areas of expertise include religious pluralism, in which he has written 2 very significant books, in the epistemology of religion, apologetics, and missions in East Asia. Dr. Netland and his wife Ruth reside in Vernon Hills, Illinois, and they have 2 daughters. He enjoys reading, hiking, music, sports, and not enough skiing, he said yesterday. So Harold Netland, come on up and minister, and thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you again. It's been wonderful to be with you this week. I've had a number of conversations over coffee, lunch, dinner, and I've enjoyed getting to know you, students and faculty, and I thank you for your very gracious hospitality. We're thinking this week about mission in a globalizing world, and part of what this means is that today mission is from everywhere to everywhere. The West itself has become a mission field, and the cultural and religious dynamics, demographics are changing. As part of that, today I'm going to be looking at Buddhism as a globalizing religion and the implications that has for how we think about religions, and in particular how we ought to be thinking about this particular religious stream as it increasingly has influence here in North America and certainly in Europe. Tomorrow we will wrap up the 4-part series. I will be looking primarily at globalization and the theology of religions, so a bit of a more explicitly theological focus tomorrow. Up to this point it's been heavily descriptive, looking at some of the changes in the world and the implications that raises for us. Tomorrow, hopefully some of the pieces will come together as we think about what an evangelical theology of religions in a globalizing world might involve. Well, roughly 80% of the world's population profess some religious allegiance. So making disciples of Jesus Christ of all peoples thus involves sharing the gospel with adherents of other religions and challenging them to accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior. Well, if we're to be effective in this task, then we must have some understanding of their religious framework. So it seems natural to assume that the study of other religions is an integral part of missiology. And indeed, many of the early missionary pioneers, such as Matteo Ricci, or Bartolomeo Ziegenbalg, or William Carey, or James Legge, were also very careful students of non-Christian religions. Evangelical missiology during the past century, however, has been less inclined to devote the time and the effort that is necessary for responsible study of other religions. There's great need for such study today. For not only does religion continue to be prominent in our world, but the ways in which people think about and practice religion are being transformed by globalization. So if we wish to understand current religious realities, it's not enough merely to study and then perpetuate some of the assumptions from the distant past. On an empirical level, religious beliefs, practices, and self-understandings change over time. And thus, in considering a contemporary religion, it's important not only to look at its past history, but also to examine how it's being shaped today through encounter with current challenges. What happens, for example, when a very ancient religion encounters modernization and globalization? This morning I'll consider this question by looking at Buddhism, and at Zen Buddhism in particular, using it to illustrate how ancient religious traditions can take on fresh manifestations and adapt to very different and new contexts. Buddhism, like Islam and Christianity, is an example of what Mark Juergensmeyer calls transnational religions, or a religion of expansion, and I quote from Juergensmeyer. In these traditions, the very core of their faith includes the notion that their religion is greater than any local group and cannot be confined to the cultural boundaries of any particular region. These are religious traditions with universal pretensions and global ambitions. It's a hallmark of Muslims, Christians, and Buddhists that they believe that their religious ideas are universally acceptable. Well, that Christianity and Islam have universal pretensions and global ambitions is hardly news. But Buddhism? Can this quaint and exotic religion of meditating monks and tranquil gardens have global ambitions? In fact, Buddhism has always been a missionary religion, moving intentionally beyond its land of origin into very different cultures and societies. The Japanese Buddhist scholar Hajime Nakamura states, quote, "Soon after the founding of the order, the Buddha sent out his followers on missionary journeys to spread the Dharma with the command, 'Fare ye forth, brethren, on the mission that is for the good of the many, for the happiness of the many, to take compassion to the world, to work for the profit and good and happiness of gods and men. Go singly, go not in pairs,'" end quote. I always find it interesting when sacred texts from other religions are translated into Shakespearean English, but I guess it lends something of gravitas to the content. Although for over 2 millennia Buddhism was found exclusively in Asia, like Christianity, it too is a religion intended for all humankind. During the past century, it has become established as a significant part of the religious landscape of the West. What we know today as Buddhism is really a diverse family of religious and philosophical traditions which have developed over the past 2,500 years in many different cultures. Emerging originally in India, Buddhism quickly spread throughout the Indian subcontinent, moved into Southeast Asia, then into Central Asia, on into China, Korea, and Japan. And as the teachings of the Buddha were embraced by people in very different cultural and religious settings, Buddhism itself changed in significant ways, resulting in the enormous variety in teachings and practices among contemporary Buddhists. But in spite of all the diversity, all Buddhists trace their beliefs and practices in some sense back to the enlightenment of Gautama the Buddha under the Bodhi tree and to the teachings that derive from this experience. Siddhartha Gautama lived either in the 6th or the 5th century BC, in what is now the border region of India and Nepal. Written accounts of his life actually do not appear until some 400 years after his death. But the popular narratives of his life tell of young Gautama being brought up in a life of luxury. Gautama abandons his palace life, however, and embarks upon a quest to discover the causes and the cure to suffering. After much experimentation with meditative and ascetic disciplines, Gautama becomes fully enlightened or awakened. From that point on, he's called the Buddha, the awakened one. The Buddha grasped the fundamental causes of existence and suffering and how to make them cease. Over the next 45 years, he traveled widely, preaching the Dharma and attracting many, many disciples. The heart of the Buddha's teaching is the so-called Four Noble Truths, which in turn are embedded within a worldview which affirms multiple rebirths regulated by the principle of karma. The first truth states that all existence is characterized by suffering or pain or discontent. Even the most intense pleasures are temporary and unfulfilling. All aspects of existence, including pleasure and joy, involve discontent. The second truth holds that the root cause of such pain is thirst or craving or desire. Now, it's not simply wrong desires that produce dissatisfaction, it's desire itself that produces pain or suffering. The third truth says that when desire ceases, then pain ceases as well. And the fourth truth introduces the Noble Eightfold Path, which sets out the way in which we are to eliminate desire and pain. There's an elegant simplicity and logical structure to the Buddha's Four Noble Truths. First, there's a diagnosis of the predicament, resulting in pervasive suffering, followed by a prescription for the cure to the causes of the suffering. Both the diagnosis and the cure are embedded in a very sophisticated metaphysic, at the heart of which is the notion of impermanence. Everything is in a continual flux, coming into being and passing out of being. Beings are continually being reborn, with the condition of one's rebirth being determined by karma, the principle regulating current and future conditions in light of previous behavior and dispositions. The entire process of birth, death, and rebirth continues endlessly, without any end, unless the causal chain of karma is broken. Nirvana, which alone is permanent and unconditioned, is the reality that obtains when the fires of desire and the conditions producing rebirth have been eliminated. Now, in time, of course, Buddhists developed complex elaborations of these very basic teachings, and this resulted in very different schools of thought and different traditions within Buddhism. Broadly, there are three major traditions: the Theravada Buddhist tradition, the Mahayana, and the Vajrayana, or the Tibetan traditions. Lots of differences between them, but we're not going to explore them further here. Zen is a part of Mahayana Buddhism. And Mahayana Buddhism entered China sometime around the 1st century, moved then into Korea around the 4th century, and then into Japan about the 6th century AD. Today, Mahayana is found in China, Korea, Vietnam, Japan, and much of the West, Germany, France, in Europe in particular, and then the United States. As Buddhism moved from the Indian subcontinent north into China, Korea, and Japan, it encountered very different cultures from what they had back in India. Mahayana Buddhism has been remarkably flexible in adapting to these new environments. The notions of rebirth and karma, for example, which are so central to the Indian religious and philosophical context, were lacking in the Chinese context. Consequently, one finds in Chinese, Korean, and Japanese Buddhism a decreasing emphasis upon the notion of nirvana as release from rebirth, and greater emphasis upon the much more positive notion of enlightenment in this life. So the ideal became not so much release from rebirth, but rather harmony within the social and the cosmic order, which is to be achieved by attaining a penetrating and a liberating insight into the actual nature of reality, right here in this life. As Buddhism spread throughout East Asia, it did not reject the popular indigenous religious cults and practices. It absorbed them. Thus, Chinese Buddhism showed its support for the family, and of course, in the Chinese context, the family is of basic importance, filial piety from the Confucian ethic. Chinese Buddhism showed its support for the family by accepting the ancient ancestral cult and making it central to Buddhist practice. Well, Buddhism has continued to change as it adapts to new environments. This is evident when we consider the transmission of Zen Buddhism to the West, late in the 19th century and then at the beginning of the 20th century. There are today about 4 million Buddhists in the United States, and Zen is one of the most popular and influential forms of Buddhism in the West. Now, the numbers are deceiving. The numbers are not that great, but if you look at the cultural influence of Buddhism, it's enormous. Within the academy, among academics, within the entertainment industries, Hollywood and music, many prominent figures are overt adherents of Buddhism of one form or another. Well, tradition maintains that the origin of Zen lies in the esoteric teachings of the historical Gautama Buddha. Standing on Vulture Peak, the Buddha held a lotus blossom before his disciples and silently smiled. One disciple, Mahakasyapa, received the wordless sermon and smiled in return. The Buddha then announced, quote, "I have this treasure of unmistakable teaching, wonderful mind of nirvana, and have given it to Mahakasyapa, his disciple." Well, this wonderful teaching was transmitted directly, and that means non-verbally, through 28 Indian patriarchs, the last of whom was the legendary Bodhidharma. And Bodhidharma is said, is said to have been the one who brought the lamp of enlightenment to China. Tradition also attributes to Bodhidharma the cryptic poem which captures the heart of Zen. And I quote from this 4-stanza poem. Special transmission outside Scripture. No dependence on words or letters. Direct pointing at the soul of man. Seeing into one's own nature and attaining Buddhahood. That's the heart of Zen. Zen Buddhism, as it was called in China, was introduced into Japan in the 7th century, where it became known as Zen. Zen emphasizes rigorous meditation, which is said to enable a direct, penetrating insight into the nature of ultimate reality, sunyata, or emptiness. And with this insight, you have a radically transformed understanding of life and the world. Zen is suspicious of verbal, conceptual, and logical formulations, and emphasizes direct, pure experience. Although Zen itself is one of the smaller Japanese Buddhist denominations with only about 10 million adherents, its intellectual and cultural influence upon Japan have been enormous. Zen influence is evident in Japanese art, in literature, the rich symbolism of the tea ceremony, flower arranging, as well as gardening. Zen discipline shaped Bushido, the code of the warrior, in 18th century Japan. Thus, in both Japan and in the West, Zen has become identified with Japanese culture more generally. Now, although European and American intellectuals had been fascinated with Buddhism since the early 19th century, it really was the 1893 World's Parliament of Religions in Chicago that initiated the Buddhist mission to the West, and it was a mission to the West. In order to understand this development properly, though, we need to consider briefly the social and cultural context of late 19th century Japan. For both the understanding of Buddhism within Japan at that time and the manner in which it was portrayed in the West were shaped in part by Japan's attempt to come to grips with modernization and the West. Japan at that time was just emerging from over 2 centuries of self-imposed isolation from the rest of the world, and it had embarked upon an ambitious process of rapid modernization. Japan was seeking parity with the great Western powers. This was a time of enormous social and political upheaval. Tensions between the pull of modernity and the longing for tradition were kept in check by an emerging nationalism, which cultivated a fresh ethnic and religious identity for the Japanese. And we're talking about the mid to late 19th century here. The astonishing Japanese victory over the Russians in the War of 1904 to 1905 gave an enormous boost to Japanese pride. A militant nationalism, fed by a carefully crafted manipulation of Shinto ideology and the emperor cult, thrust Japan down the precarious path of invading Manchuria and China, and then into World War II. Well, the Japanese delegation to the 1893 Parliament was part of a movement by progressives to produce what they called a new Buddhism, appropriate to the modern democratic state and fully equal to the intellectual and religious traditions of the West. Judith Snodgrass is a scholar who has studied this period, and she observes that the purposes of the delegation was, quote, to convince Western intellectuals that Japanese Buddhism was the equal of Western philosophy, superior to Western religion, and completely in accord with Western science, end quote. The attempt to demonstrate a form of Buddhism fully compatible with modernity and indeed superior to Western traditions, while remaining firmly rooted in ancient Japanese cultural patterns, has shaped subsequent Western perceptions of Buddhism. Now, if you think about it missiologically, what's going on here is what we as Christian missiologists call contextualization. Only this time, it's in a reverse form, Buddhist contextualization to the modernizing West. The Japanese delegation returned to Japan convinced that the materialistic and hedonistic culture of America was hungering for Eastern spirituality. Shakusoen was a very progressive Japanese Buddhist who attended the 1893 Parliament. While there, he met Dr. Paul Karras, editor of the journals The Open Court and The Monist. Now, Karras was the son of a Protestant pastor from Germany, but Karras had rejected Orthodox Christianity. Karras was a passionate advocate of what he called a religion of science, which would unify the many different religions of the world, and he felt that Buddhism was especially appropriate for this purpose. Karras found a kindred spirit in the Japanese Buddhist Shakusoen, who was eager to promote Buddhism in the West as a modern, universal religion. After the Parliament, Soen encouraged his young disciple, Daisetsu Suzuki, to take the Dharma to America. So in 1897, at Karras' invitation, the young Suzuki moved to LaSalle, Illinois, to work as a translator at Open Court Publishing. Over the next 50 years, Suzuki split his time between Japan and the United States, lecturing in major universities in the US and Britain, publishing over 100 books and articles on Buddhism, and launching the journal The Eastern Buddhist. He died in Japan in 1966 at the age of 95. Through his many writings, lectures, and personal contacts with Western intellectuals, Suzuki became the most influential spokesman for Buddhism in the West. Robert Scharf is another scholar who has studied this movement, and I quote from him now, quote, "Zen was introduced to Western scholarship through the activities of an elite circle of internationally minded Japanese intellectuals and globe-trotting Zen priests, whose missionary zeal was often second only to their vexed fascination with Western culture," end quote. Now, my purpose in focusing upon Suzuki's transmission of Zen to the U.S. is to illustrate how perceptions of a religious tradition can be shaped by a variety of factors external to that tradition itself. Suzuki is often taken by Westerners to be a dispassionate, meticulous scholar whose depiction of Zen is simply an objective restatement of classical Buddhism for Western audiences. In fact, however, Suzuki's views were very controversial, and he was frequently criticized by other Japanese Buddhists for his portrayal of Buddhism. Heinrich Dumoulin, for example, notes that, quote, "Japanese Zen Buddhists were often astounded at the transformation Zen was undergoing in the West, and they differentiated between the traditional form of Japanese Zen and that which they called Suzuki Zen," end quote. Moreover, Suzuki himself was the product of various influences. Between 1903 and 1924, for example, when his early writings on Zen were taking shape, Suzuki had strong interests both in Swedenborgianism and the Theosophical Society. Suzuki translated 4 of the 18th century mystic Emanuel Swedenborg's works into Japanese, and he published a full book-length study of Swedenborg in 1913. In the 1920s, Suzuki and his American wife Beatrice opened a Theosophical Lodge in Kyoto. Suzuki was also influenced to some extent by the strong Japanese nationalism in place in the 1920s and 1930s. Well, American society in the 1950s and 60s, when Suzuki's influence was at its height, was ready for Suzuki's kind of Zen. Many Americans were searching for a religious and intellectual alternative to traditional Christianity. The cumulative effects of 2 devastating world wars, the terrors of Hiroshima and the Cold War, violent anti-colonialist movements of nationalism throughout Africa and Asia and Latin America, disillusionment with the rampant consumerism and materialism of Western societies, the perception of institutional Christianity as an irrelevant vestige of a bygone era, and a deepening disenchantment with science and technology all work together to erode confidence in traditional Western assumptions and institutions. Eastern spirituality was welcomed as an antidote to Western decadence and bankruptcy. Suzuki's portrayal of Zen shaped an eager generation's perception of Buddhism and of Eastern spirituality. We do not have time this morning to explore Suzuki's portrayal of Zen and note how it differs in some respects from more traditional Buddhist traditions within Asia. Instead, I will simply note several criticisms that have been leveled against his views. For example, critics have pointed out that Suzuki's emphasis upon the paradoxical and the irrational elements in Japanese Zen treating these as really defining characteristics of Buddhism, is at odds with other traditional streams of Buddhism. Suzuki regularly emphasized the irrationality of satori, or the enlightenment experience, and I quote from Suzuki now. By this I mean that satori is enlightenment, by this I mean that satori is not a conclusion to be reached by reasoning and defies all intellectual determination. The satori experience is always characterized by irrationality, inexplicability, and incommunicability. The knowledge realized by satori is final. No amount of logical argument can refute it. Being direct and personal, it is sufficient unto itself. End quote. But this understanding of Zen is controversial even among Buddhists. Buddhism has historically given very careful attention to issues in logic and epistemology, and Theravada Buddhists in particular have emphasized the rationality of Buddhist principles. They will frequently criticize Christians for relying upon faith, and they will say there's no place for faith in Buddhism. It's rational analysis and experience. Many Buddhists emphasize that Buddhism is based solely upon reason and experience, and thus has no place for faith. And I quote here again from the Japanese Buddhist Hajime Nakamura. According to Buddhism, faith becomes superstition when it is not examined by reason. Gautama was described as one who reasoned according to the truth rather than on the basis of the authority of the Vedas or tradition, end quote. Or the Sri Lankan Buddhist scholar Jayatileki insists that for Gautama the Buddha, inconsistency itself was a criterion of falsehood, and I quote from Jayatileki. In arguing with his opponents, the Buddha often shows that their theories lead to inconsistencies or contradictions, thereby demonstrating that they are false. This means that truth itself must be consistent, end quote. Well, this hardly sounds like a religion which rejects reason and rational analysis. Second, critics point out that Suzuki ignores the historical roots of Zen and the variety within Buddhism with his claim that somehow Japanese Zen captures the essence of not only Buddhism, but of Eastern spirituality in general. There is in Suzuki a tension between two themes that are very difficult to reconcile. On the one hand, Zen is said to transcend all religious and cultural particularities, for Zen is said to be, quote, the spirit of all religion and philosophy, end quote. Following Paul Karras, Suzuki saw in Zen the potential for a unifying common ground for all of the world's religions. And I quote from Suzuki here. Our standpoint is that the Mahayana ought to be considered one whole individual thing, and no sects, especially no sectarian prejudices, to be recognized in it, except as so many phases or aspects of one fundamental truth. In this respect, Buddhism and Christianity and all other religions and all other religious beliefs are not more than variations of one single original faith deeply embedded in the human soul, end quote. And yet this universal emphasis was counterbalanced by a highly particularistic theme in which Zen was identified not only with the essence of Buddhism, but with the essence of Japanese spirituality. So, in a typical passage, Suzuki also states, quote, in Zen are found systematized, or rather crystallized, all the philosophy, religion, and life itself of the Far Eastern people, especially the Japanese, end quote. Well, needless to say, not only other Asian Buddhists, but Hindus, Jains, Sikhs, and Taoists would strongly dispute the reduction of Eastern spiritual traditions to Japanese Zen. Finally, Suzuki's characterization of Zen draws upon what has been called the discourse of Orientalism, characteristic of some 19th and 20th century intellectuals. And some of you will recognize the reference here to the seminal work by Edward Said, Orientalism, and the debate and discussions that stimulated. Orientalist discourse, which is usually associated with Western scholars of Eastern peoples, typically makes a very sharp distinction between the East and the West, with sweeping generalizations about the East which ignore the many differences within the many Asian societies, cultures, and religions. So, According to this discourse, Orientalists depicted the West and Western religion, by which they meant Christianity, in highly favorable terms, whereas the East and Eastern religion were characterized in terms of negative contrast with the West. But some Asian intellectuals very skillfully turned the tables by utilizing the discourse of Orientalism in order to construct fresh cultural and religious identities, thereby playing off the East in a very positive way against the West. In this kind of reverse Orientalism, the West is portrayed as crassly materialistic, crude, ethically insensitive, violent, spiritually bankrupt, and obsessed with irrationality and scientism that keep it from really recognizing genuine spiritual truth and insight. By contrast, the East is depicted as gentle and nonviolent, ethically sensitive, harmonious, wise, guardians of an intuitive, mystical spirituality that transcends the superficiality of Western ways. Well, what was introduced to the West in the early 20th century as the essence of Buddhism and Eastern spirituality was in part just a construct of just such a process. And I'm going to quote from a rather extensive statement from Robert Scharf, who makes this point with reference to Suzuki's rhetoric about Buddhism vis-a-vis the West. Quoting Scharf, "Having lived through the military humiliation of Japan at the hands of the culturally inferior Occidental powers, Suzuki would devote a considerable portion of his prodigious energies tantalizing a legion of disenchanted Western intellectuals with the dream of an Oriental enlightenment. Yet all the while, Suzuki held that the cultural and spiritual weaknesses of the Occident virtually precluded the possibility of Westerners ever coming to truly comprehend Zen. One is led to suspect that Suzuki's lifelong effort to bring Buddhist enlightenment to the Occident had become inextricably bound to a studied contempt for the West, a West whose cultural arrogance and imperialist inclinations Suzuki had come to know all too well. While Suzuki Zen claimed a privileged perspective that transcended cultural difference, it was at the same time contrived as the antithesis of everything Suzuki found deplorable about the West. So, we read repeatedly that the West is materialistic, the East spiritual, that the West is aggressive and imperialistic, while the East extols nonviolence and harmony, that the West values rationality, the East intuitive wisdom, that the West is dualistic, the East monistic, and that while the West is individualistic, setting man apart from nature, the East is communalistic, viewing man as one with nature. In short, his image of the East in general, and Japan in particular, is little more than a romantic inversion of Japanese negative stereotypes of the West, end quote. Now, my point here is not to try and denigrate or run down Suzuki. This is a fascinating study, how different peoples portray the other, and the West has certainly been guilty of misrepresenting peoples and other cultures and religions and so on. My point is simply to illustrate how current perceptions of Buddhism in the West have been shaped very skillfully by the kind of discourse that Suzuki was using. Suzuki skillfully promoted certain images and generalizations about the West and the East, which, while simplistic and misleading, have become widely accepted. The attraction of Buddhism in the West is due in part to the effective use of just such discourse to depict a mysterious and esoteric Eastern spirituality as the antidote to Western rationalism and Western materialism. Now, there are missiological lessons to be learned from this study. First, in trying to understand contemporary religious movements, it is not sufficient merely to study their historical roots and ancient doctrines. It's also important to explore how adherents of a religious tradition today understand their own tradition, especially when these perceptions are different from previous understandings within that same tradition. And in doing so, it's very important to consider how current religious self-understandings have been affected by various external factors. Inevitably, of course, the question arises, well, is Suzuki Zen really authentic Buddhism? Significantly, there is an ongoing debate among Japanese scholars today over whether Japanese Zen really is Buddhism at all, and this is an internal debate within Japanese Buddhist scholars. But while the question is a legitimate one for scholars of religion, and certainly for Buddhists themselves, there's a sense in which the question is irrelevant for missiology. For in the missiological encounter with a given religious tradition, or with adherents of a given religious tradition, what is of most importance are the current self-understandings of those within that tradition about their own religious self-identity. Thus, in an encounter with Western Buddhists who have been largely influenced by Suzuki's depiction of Zen, what matters is not so much whether Suzuki's portrayal is consistent with ancient Buddhist traditions, but rather what their current understandings and practices of Zen are. It is at that level that an encounter between their religious commitments and the gospel of Jesus Christ must occur. In this sense, the missiological study of religions cannot be limited simply to the study of the past, the origins of a given religion and its early doctrinal formulations, and that tends to be what we do as missiologists. Rather, it must be an ongoing enterprise which continually investigates current religious identities, beliefs, and practices, as these are shaped by contemporary forces such as modernization and globalization. Well, with globalization, the West is a mission field. Missions is from everywhere to everywhere. In the coming decades, sharing the gospel with those in the West who have been attracted to this kind of globalizing Buddhism, and especially to Suzuki's kind of repackaged Zen, is going to mean we take them seriously on their terms with their current self-understandings of what it means to be a Buddhist, and then attempt to share the gospel of Jesus Christ within that context, challenging their assumptions and encouraging them to accept Jesus Christ as the one Lord and the one Savior for all peoples, the way, the truth, and the life. Thank you.